Hello, everyone, and welcome to our training today, Defeat Cyber Fatigue, How to Keep Hybrid Work Safe. My name is Mark Hench, and I am a senior staff writer here at GovLoop. Today, I have the added pleasure of also being your moderator. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you to Red Hat, ServiceNow, and CyberArk for sponsoring this training. Let's get to it. Today, our experts will discuss how you can overcome cyber fatigue in a hybrid world. Before we jump into that topic, let's go over some quick housekeeping. If you're on Twitter, please share what you learned today using the hashtag GLTrain. We have some great resources available for you on our console, so make sure to check those out as well. We hope you don't have any technical difficulties, but if you do, send us a message to that Ask a Question tab, and my colleague Maddie will get your questions answered. In that same portal, you can ask our experts questions, so don't be shy. We're recording this training, and we'll email you a link to the entire session tomorrow. And with all of that awesome housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to our stacked lineup this afternoon. First, we have Adam German. Adam is the Chief Information Security Officer for the California State Controller's Office. He has over a decade of experience working for the Chief Fiscal Officer, and as the CISO, Adam promotes transparency through modeling financial integrity and supporting accountability throughout the California government. Next, we have Tim Weston. Tim is the Director of Strategy and Performance at the Transportation Security Administration. Previously, Mr. Weston was a senior counsel for the Security Threat Assessments Division within TSA's Chief Counsel's Enforcement and Incident Management Division. Joining us from Red Hat today is Michael Epley. Michael is the Chief Architect of Public Sector at Red Hat, and he has been helping the U.S. defense and national security communities use and adopt open source software over the last 2 decades with practical experience as a software developer and enterprise architect. Joining us from ServiceNow, we have Jonathan Alum. Jonathan is the Federal CTO and Principal Digital Strategist for the federal government at ServiceNow. In this role, Jonathan works with federal agencies to deliver digital workflows that create great experiences and unlock productivity. Last but not least, we have Andy Thompson. Andy is a global research a global research advisor at CyberArk. Andy is part of the Research Labs division at CyberArk, which conducts ongoing research into offensive technology and information security trends. Thank you all for being here. Let's start our discussion. This is for everyone. Security is at the forefront of everything these days, and with that in mind, how can agencies overcome some of the cybersecurity fatigue that is out there right now? What is one strategy that agencies can utilize to better their security postures? Does anyone want to take a go at that first?
All right, well, I'll jump in then. So again, thank you so much for having us all at the panel. If we're going to be discussing one way that's strategy to address cyber fatigue, one of the methods of fatigue that I often see is logon fatigue. The constant having to authenticate to get access, For example, just to be a VMware administrator, somebody would have to log on to their asset or their BYOD. Then they'd have to authenticate with multi-factor. Then they'd have to get into their VDI, then multi-factor, then get into vSphere, then multi-factor. You get my point. With moving to a more SSO model, you're basically getting in past that cyber fatigue of logon after logon. And you're also moving forward with the executive order and the encouragement to move to SSO. So that's one of the main ways that I see agencies can move to a more sound security posture, but also addressing cyber fatigue.
You know, this is Jonathan from ServiceNow. I just want to add that I think we get inundated with messages about cybersecurity that feel sometimes very technical, and sometimes cybersecurity is relegated to the Chief Information Security Officer, CIO, or some organization that might feel far away from people who are doing the agency's mission, policy analysts or others. I think part of getting through the fatigue is reframing the conversation away from the technology to a degree and thinking more about, one, impact on the mission and risk to program delivery, and thinking about things everyone can do to improve the cybersecurity. For example, if a program analyst is working with data that is used to make decisions about maybe benefits or some other program outcome, They need to be able to answer some questions about where their data is, how do they store and protect their data, what happens to secure it, how does it move through the organization or across agencies, and I think asking questions like that makes being able to answer those questions is going to improve your risk posture, and it also makes cybersecurity less about the IT organization and more about what they care about, which is their job and their ability to deliver on mission. So we have to reframe it a little bit, in my opinion.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was just thinking about the same type of thing where you need to get more involved with that business mindset, where take it away from the security and put it more into the business mindset to get them more involved and to actually have a better understanding of what that risk posture is from an organizational perspective. Getting the security awareness mindset and sort of the training and the education, that's the first step, but then taking it to the next level to actually have them participate within your program itself and having that transparency within the security to help with that fatigue really is a good, next step process in the evolution of our security systems and teams.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in too with a comment about zero trust, because we have seen this as kind of the future of cybersecurity. Now, I've been evangelizing this a lot, but one of the things zero trust does do is force us to think about the security of our enterprises in a holistic fashion and bring in everybody from the enterprise, and they can see the impacts directly and how they are interacting with the rest of the security enterprise, directly doing, analyzing that process and how they would implement zero trust. For example, thinking about the business processes involved in determining what you need access to and how, forces us all to think about these things. It also helps bring all these topics home. And we talked about things like SSO, for example, as being something that helps eliminate that fatigue. One of the things that we have to think about then when we're adopting zero trust is the cultural changes and how to adapt that fatigue to make sure that we can actually successfully kind of reach those goals. So things like SSO will be important and tools like that, but also things that just eliminate toil in other ways. Things like password managers or MFA that don't rely on typing in passwords constantly or tokens constantly. And so, hard credentials or things like that or facial recognition or other aspects that will allow security tools to be used without that kind of toil, or automation tools that can help us secure our systems without the manual efforts.
Hey, this is Tim. I just want to go back to, I really do agree with integrating the rest of your workforce into what we do from a security standpoint. I think the more we integrate our employees, into that process and make them own part of that process, it really does improve the overall security posture. And we've seen that in many different aspects, kind of from what I do on the TSA side. The more you build that ownership in, the better you have on the ultimate security processes.
Well, Jim, let's jump into that a little bit more. What would you say are the elements that make a strong cybersecurity framework, and how can agencies like yours ensure that this framework is fully integrated?
Yeah, so, it's been interesting. We've been doing a broad study, so maybe a little bit more about what I do specifically, which is primarily engage with our sector stakeholders on developing security programs for their own enterprise that protect the transportation system sector. So I work with a lot of different stakeholders across both the aviation and surface transportation sectors. And, we started a survey a while ago to kind of start looking at from their perspective, what makes up a good cybersecurity framework. And it's been really interesting to see the results of that come back. We're still doing a lot of the analysis on it, but it was split almost exactly even across, the different elements for all of the different cybersecurity frameworks. We didn't look at just one. We offered, the NIST cybersecurity framework, obviously from the government perspective, but also reached out about, like MITRE ATT&CK, and offered, actually asked for any, specific frameworks that they're using. And when we start looking at the data, it really is all of those main pillars that you would look at. So, recovery, identify, protect, defend, and respond. It really was all of them. And I was actually really surprised to see that from a stakeholder perspective, that they really, truly, were, if they're answering the surveys, honestly, which these were blind surveys, it was really just interesting to kind of see that. I think from our perspective, we really are trying to focus a lot more on the recovery and respond aspects more, because I think those are the two areas that we see the biggest problems. I think most stakeholders, most organizations do a pretty good job of identifying their assets that they want to protect, putting those protections in place, and building up the detection side. It's that actual, respond and recovery phase that, needs more exercise and a little bit maybe more attention.
Yeah, if I could just jump in for a second, I think that's an excellent point. Before I joined ServiceNow, I was a CIO in the federal government, variety of agencies, including Department of Agriculture CIO. And, you're not today judged on whether or not there was an incident. There are going to be incidents. We've come, to realize this is normal. But you are judged on how you recover. And are you able to quickly understand the impact? When it keeps changing, your perspective of what the impact was, you don't understand what happened, or you can't get back to service, you're viewed harshly, in my experience. So you made an excellent point. You have to have tools in place to recover quickly and understand what was lost or what happened. And it's a great place to be focused.
Yeah, also add too on the topic of testing. One of the things that was mentioned was the need to exercise our processes, recovery and response, of course, being one of those, and the ability to actually do testing, adversarial testing, or testing of our response and recovery plans, either in controlled environments or ideally, using your actual incident and response planning and tools, is an important element of validating that you've got these frameworks fully integrated and that you can actually recover correctly when you do have these incidents. And I think we're seeing more focus on this adversarial testing inside of our frameworks and deployment of those adversarial testing inside of our systems.
I think one of the things that you guys all touched on, which is really good, is the integration of that testing into your business processes. From the perspective of understanding what the impact could potentially be and how you recover from that.
And now for our government speakers on the call, what would you say are you noticing with the supply chains that you deal with right now in terms of what they're particularly vulnerable to with potential attacks? How can agencies like the ones you work at, Andy and Adam, work to better secure these supply chains? Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, so specifically when you're working with those supply chains, it's it's almost like a cat and mouse game, really. So what we're doing is we're reviewing all of our contractual agreements and confirming that we have risk management processes baked in place when it comes to dealing with those third-party vendors as well. Some of the things that we've been looking specifically at is trying to bake in having third-party auditors go and validate and confirm with them as well. So, we've all done the SOC 2 Type 2, and we've all looked at that, but is your team specifically going out and validating that as well? And so that's one of the things that we've been trying to push as well, is have our own internal teams validate that, they have a third-party auditor that came in, but let's trust but verify that, right?
Now,
And
if we're talking, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, after you.
I was just going to say, if we're talking about supply chains and securing the supply chains from a DevOps perspective, which is the reason I'm here. One of the recommendations that we have is identifying the tier 0 assets from a high risk perspective. Because let's face it, there's definitely some assets such as your orchestrators, Jenkins, Ansible, and other tier 0 assets like Kubernetes that provide a real strong attack vector for malicious actors out there. So what we would recommend is brokering access securely to those sorts of orchestrators, as well as the removal of any sort of hard-coded credential within that CI/CD pipeline. Making sure that you are auditing your third parties as well. And those are just some of the recommendations to prevent that similar situation we saw with CodeCove and SolarWinds, is, protecting these sorts of simple controls to prevent the complex supply chain attacks.
I think also when you look in the EO, there are a lot of requirements that are going to be placed on software manufacturers, vendors, to ensure the security of their supply chain. So from a agency perspective, I think you have to ask, well, how well do you understand what your vendors are doing to support these requirements? How well are they positioned to understand all the software components that they're creating and selling into the government? And there's a combination, I think, of software asset management and understanding what all the providers, and really hardware asset management, because there's a lot of software embedded in hardware. So once you understand all those IT assets, and the statement was made, we have a good sense of what they are. And I think largely we do, but we could always do better. Now you add in a vendor risk management component. So you're connecting vendor risk information into your hardware asset repository, software asset repository. Now you can identify areas of real risk based in your environment based on how your vendors are managing the security of their supply chain, the software supply chain. And that has a direct positive impact, I think, inside an agency. So I think there's a lot of ways to do this. It's a very complex world we live in now. So you can't just, in my opinion, take one approach. You need to come at it from a few angles.
Yeah, and speaking of that, it's important for vendors to also be able to react when incidents do occur. We've seen a number of notable attacks and incidents where their speed of response has been particularly important, because we're moving in an era where exploits can happen very quickly. We are seeing ransomware as a service or exploits as a service that can have very large-scale impacts very quickly. And vendors have to, of course, be able to respond quickly to those threats. So it's be able to patch or update their systems rapidly, roll out and be able to validate that those fixes in fact solve these issues or close those security vulnerabilities. So it's important, to somebody's point, to have a vendor that has that supply chain in order to rapidly iterate and provide those updates when necessary.
Yeah, I actually think so. Looking at the executive order in particular, I mean, really focusing in and putting in the software bill of materials aspect to that EO was probably one of the bigger requirements that executive order put out there from the federal government side, because I think that's something you really want to talk about, affecting change downstream. That's one of those areas I really truly see over the next 1 to 2 years, hopefully getting a lot of traction and change there. So I think that's it's going to be interesting to watch that space from my perspective.
And what are all your thoughts on ransomware and how this fits into what agencies are dealing with in terms of cybersecurity? Does anyone have anything they would like to contribute there?
Well, I'll start by just saying that ransomware is probably one of the main sources of fatigue these days. Everybody has seen the impact that ransomware can have, and the notoriety that can be created if you're a victim of a ransomware attack and not prepared for it. And we've also seen it testing, our recovery processes, to a comment earlier. And I think we're seeing a lot of people struggle now to get ahead of that threat and beef up their recovery and response procedures in light of how ransomware operates. But it's also a game of cat and mouse. We're seeing ransomware attackers kind of modify their modes of operation and kind of how they work to extract and move from ransomware to other forms of attacks. And it's a big challenge in that it is in some sense a fundamental issue of hardening and securing our systems, but it's also how we respond when those attacks do happen. In many cases involving public relations, negotiations, and things like that are outside the normal bounds of what we would think of as security practitioners.
Yeah, one thing I think we've seen, in speaking from experience living through the Colonial Pipeline incident and the response from the federal government side, one of the things we really got to focus on more is a lot more that threat intelligence sharing. That was even put into the executive order on cybersecurity, which was there before the Colonial incident occurred, I think, on the federal government side. But being better at sharing that information, that threat intelligence to help better build a more collective defense to ransomware, I think is going to be really important. We've had a lot of engagements over the last several months on better intelligence sharing, better information sharing. And, you saw that in the EO. We talk about it a lot, but it's difficult, I think, to put into place sometimes because there are certain concerns that, like, I'm an attorney by trade. So, I know there's some concerns there from a legal standpoint. Do we really want to share this information? Do we really want to share those IOCs or those TTPs across other, others within our sector or across critical infrastructure or across the government, for fear of, regulation, retribution, legal liability. But I think if we get past that, the sooner we get past that and actually do a better job of sharing that information across the board. I mean, that it's across, all levels of government, state, local, federal, and across critical infrastructure and industry, the better we're going to be at protecting against that ransomware threat.
When it comes to ransomware, I think it's also I agree with what everyone's been saying here. The sort of the best defense is not to be there, right? Do things that are going to prevent you from suffering in the first place. But if it does happen, now, as a CIO, you're going to get called into question. What were you doing in terms of monitoring and protecting your infrastructure? Do you have backups? Can you recover from a data loss? Do you understand where all your data is? There's going to be questions that people expect a CIO or leader inside a IT organization to be able to answer. So, the current situation is, it's dire in a lot of places, but there are things that you can do now to be better positioned if it does happen. And I think we should assume that it will. So, and then being able, when you detect something on your network that looks like it might be ransomware, well, you need some kind of workflow technology to create action and automate actions to remediate that risk as soon as possible, instead of observing it and then getting caught off guard when it really corrupts all of your disk space and you're out of luck. Take quick action. So we need tools to protect our data, to be able to recover, to take quick action when we see something's happening. Those are foundational responsibilities for anybody who's in charge of an IT organization. And I think that we have to refocus some of our attention on those core things, even though they're not exciting sometimes. And if it goes well, no one's going to notice them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Like, I'm just sitting here thinking about all the things that you're talking about here, and it all boils down to the baseline basics that a lot of times when we watch these breaches that are going on in the news, it goes back to the basics: minimizing your impact, minimizing the likelihood of occurrence, and following a zero trust model. That's really going to help you with that. When we're looking at these ransomware attacks that are happening, propagating throughout your network like that should your network been set up in that way in the first place? So it's the boring part no one likes to talk about, but it's going back to the basics and understanding how your infrastructure is set up, being able to recover from that quickly, doing your basic backups, understanding the zero trust model, minimizing your impact, minimizing the likelihood it occurs, that type of thing.
The only thing I would add to all that, and I agree. Incorporating the zero trust architecture into, your operations is vital. I think at this point, leveraging a little bit more some of the cloud-based security features that are out there. Again, tying it back a little bit to the executive order. That was specifically called out in that executive order, and I think for good reason. I think the more we can, diversify and diffuse out, especially some of your data backups, it makes it easier to recover from those incidents.
Yeah, I'll amplify the back to the basics too, because we evangelize that as well at Red Hat. The basics of security hardening, security, reducing your security risk and footprint and vulnerabilities. And I think the real challenge these days is we're extending those same concepts into areas that we're to some extent unfamiliar with, whether it's cloud, as mentioned, or IoT, or segmenting our enterprise networks and work from home models and remote work models. And these kind of things are challenging what is basic and what's required in those environments. Take cloud security, for example, where we almost take it for granted that clouds are more secure because somebody's managing that infrastructure for us. But we forget to do things like the basic credential management or access management to those cloud accounts. And that turns out to be one of the big vulnerabilities in the cloud is, having to essentially go back to those basics and do that. But yeah, zero trust and other concepts like that will help us address those kind of issues, and particularly focus on those things. But having to rethink that is adding to that, fatigue, and having to rethink everything from the ground up in some cases, even if it is just basic security.
Now let's see if we can get to a sort of round-robin round with everyone here. On that note, culturally speaking, how do you think agencies need to rethink how they train and hold their employees accountable for cybersecurity? Do you have any thoughts about that, Mike, to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. And I just mentioned a few of the aspects that are causing us to rethink and reframe security, and I think it boils down to the fact that we are entering a new realm of how our enterprises operate, partly driven by the pandemic and the remote work requirements that's created for us. But it's also, I think, created some opportunities there as well in how we reframe that, because we are now talking about security being everyone's responsibility, and it's much more visible for our workforces when we do talk in those terms, because they interact with the security apparatus regularly, whether they're using a VPN or a VDI or multi-factor authentication. It's, I think, a lot more top of mind for agencies. I think what we need to do to arm them, though, is strategies, not just to think about what the potential risks are, but to counter those risks. So whether it's helping them understand what zero trust is and what the value is and how it works, or what the common vulnerability or threat models are for their particular agencies and use cases. Going back to like the MITRE framework, what are some of the attack vectors, or going back to threat monitoring, what's being currently exploited right now and what extra precautions are important. And arming our workforces with that information, I think, will help them keep abreast of these and keep moving forward on improving our security postures.
What do the rest of you say to that in terms of culturally speaking, how agencies can deal with training and holding their employees accountable for cybersecurity efforts?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I agree with everything with what he just said. I mean, I think, training may, looking at it from a fatigue standpoint, providing training, kind of helps break that fatigue. Sometimes you run the risk of getting into training fatigue. At the same time, I know, we're constantly being updated and pinged on different, processes and procedures out there. But, use as an opportunity. I with my particular team and my, that I manage, I'm always trying to, push them to be creative, find other training that's out there that, to expose them to new topics, to get the, try and be on that cutting edge of what's out there. What do they need to do to respond to those threats that are out there? And one thing I want to kind of go back to a little bit, we talked a little bit about automation, and I think incorporating a little bit more automation into our security protocols will help with some of that to a certain extent, because then it makes you introduce that human element to actually go in, though, and address those problems that the automation can't address, right? So, from an engagement standpoint, now your team's more engaged. Now they're thinking through a little bit more critical problems, or researching some of those issues, those TTPs that are out there, and exploring the threat vectors and the tactics that, are being, developed. I mean, the adversaries we're facing are, they're very smart. They're very nimble. We've got to be just as smart and nimble. So, I really try to engage my team, and encourage that across, across the enterprise.
Just on the training, we were talking about ransomware before. Phishing is still a very effective way for a bad guy to begin their way into an agency, an organization. So, I did a lot of phishing training when I was, a CIO. I currently at ServiceNow, we were tested all the time on our ability to detect malicious emails, and they can be very deceptive. And one of the most effective email phishing test that I ever saw was when I worked in the government, and there was a phishing email that came from the Office of HR or something like this, which wasn't a real office, but it said your telework agreement is being changed. And a lot of people clicked this agreement. Something personal, sensitive, right? There was no Office of HR. It wasn't, there were a million things wrong with that email, but, they hit me as something that was personal. So it's training our users to be suspicious of anything sent to them, especially something that, piques their interest. And just, take a breath before you click the link and think it through. And we do these phishing trainings probably in a lot of our agencies. It's a place I would invest in, think about the incentives to, get agency employees to, just to be mindful and zero trust mentality, if you will, to this effort.
Yeah, when we're talking specifically about our employees and the awareness, I see it in three different aspects. We're talking about training, awareness, and education, and trying to keep that open, transparent dialogue between the security teams and the rest of the organization is important. Doing those phishing campaigns, following that baseline best practice is, so important. Understanding, for example, the least privileged access when we're talking about phishing. Does everyone in the organization have a business need to be receiving emails outside the organization? Something as simple as that from a least privileged access perspective, what is the reason for that? Only give people access what they need to do their jobs. That's a basic concept, least privileged concept, but yet we all do things just because it's the easy button, right? So, it's having that awareness, having that training, having that education, and the open dialogue with the staff and the business. Let them contact you, have that open transparency with them, and get them to be part of your team. Let them know what you're doing. Don't be that black box of their security. They do that cyber stuff out there, because really the basis of that sits on their shoulders. It sits on their, their backs to actually protect. They're the first defenders.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there because what you just described is very much as, we started with it, zero trust question here, and it's very much in the vein of a zero trust response. And the idea that we should be looking at security as a question of whether or not we need to perform or need to engage with a particular IT system in order to perform our jobs or our mission. And sending emails to an external user or something like that can certainly raise that kind of question. You also touched on another topic there, which is whether or not, and this was brought up earlier, automation can help with that too, in the sense of using access brokers or other tools like that can help with those questions. So if users have anti-phishing email, we have automation tools now that can evaluate emails or run those emails through security gateways to evaluate whether or not they're safe. And relying on automation to help our users make those right decisions and to help provide data for them to make the correct decisions when they are faced with those challenges. It's also an important part of that. So whether it's access brokers, other tools, the automation or tools like that can also help implement and make those kind of choices easier to do and easier to do the right thing.
We've had a couple of great audience questions come in over the last few minutes, so I thought I would start with one of those. Is there any lesson that we think that the public sector could learn from the private sector when it comes to cybersecurity? Does anyone have any thoughts about what's one thing the private sector could teach the public sector about cybersecurity?
Well, having worked in the government for a long time and now working in the private sector, I think the impact of cybersecurity is very well articulated to the people that I work with. We get messages from our CIO and CISO around the impact to our business, if we have a cyber attack, and the impact to our customers. The agencies we support and private sector business we support. And, it's made really clear the role that we have as individuals in ensuring the success of our business and our customers' business. in operations. So, I think connecting back into the mission and the risk that an agency employee could bring to program delivery, to a citizen, to someone in need who gets benefit, or to a critical operation of the U.S. government, is really important. We should talk about our activities around cybersecurity, and not in terms of risk per se, but in terms of mission delivery impact. And I'd frame this discussion to your average agency employee in those terms, and really stress their responsibility and their role in making sure the agency functions for the American people.
Yeah, I'm going to go back, kind of back to my original, response to one of the first questions, and that's really focusing on the recovery aspect of incident response. And I think being incorporating some of those best practices that we've seen out there from the private sector and on the public sector, a little bit more. I think we've done a pretty good job on the government side, but I think there's always room for improvement, right? Looking at like the SolarWinds, incident earlier this year and the effects that had, I think, because bureaucracy across all levels of government is slow to move sometimes, cutting through that red tape and that bureaucracy to affect change, to recover, is something that we need to work on, and I get it. There's certain reasons for that to be there, but at the same time, I think that that's one area that we could really, from the government side, probably improve on.
So we're running out of time here, and I'll just start with you, Tim, as you were speaking last. What would you say is the main takeaway that you hope someone has about cybersecurity today during this session?
The theme of today's session is combating that fatigue. I think again, looking for ways to be creative, to look outside the box for solutions. I think that's one way we can help kind of combat that fatigue. I think looking at some of those automated security features we've talked about, and going back even beginning making it easier, looking for those that SSOs, so you're not having to go through so many different steps just to log into the systems that you need, so making those systems more secure from the outset, will help tremendously. Yeah. And then the last thing is just, again, being vigilant to the threats that are out there, looking at, we've discussed ransomware. I see ransomware as a symptom of a larger, disease. And we've kind of touched on that a little bit here, with some of the cyber hygiene, discussion, but, focusing on, let's focus on curing the overall problem, which really, gets down to building in a better security culture across the board. And you'll start to see some of those other things go away, like the ransomware.
What about you, Randy? Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and add a little bit to the theme there, which I also think one of the important aspects is to look at all these challenges that we're facing. Ransomware is a great example. Is also an opportunity to rethink some of our basic approaches and reassess how we are both working with our security teams and our security infrastructure in these new contexts like remote work, and that opportunity might mean we get to deploy new tools, new technologies, change how we operate. Zero Trust, for example, is going to flip security on its head and force us to rethink how we operate. And we might decide that, VDI is the right way to go, or some other tool. And that will present, opportunities. And those opportunities will, and the attention that cybersecurity and some of these threats have created and challenges have created, mean that we have the budgets and attention from our CIO offices to potentially effectuate some of these changes that might help us solve some of those challenges.
One of the things that you highlighted there was Zero Trust and how that's an ongoing initiative going forward with the government. What I want you as attendees to take away from today is that it's not just about Zero Trust, but also just-in-time access have to go hand in hand. my job as, representing the offensive security side of this is, what would I do as an attacker in a situation where I can simply bypass the authentication? That's the zero trust. I then get unfettered access, and that's what we're trying to prevent. So if you don't have if the access doesn't exist to begin with, bypassing authentication is pointless. So my point here is that really, for true zero trust infrastructure and security to exist, it's a combination of zero trust access along with just-in-time provisioning of that access. So that's my little soapbox. I'll step down.
I'd offer that, in addition to everything that was said, cyber fatigue can, extend sometimes into the IT organization and into a security office. And look at all of the tools that have been introduced into a security operations center over the past few years. Every 6 months, there's a new tool. And we buy a lot of these tools, and they create lots and lots of data. And those log files they create can be overwhelming to find the proverbial signal in the noise. So, I think we need tools that help us, quickly interpret that data, that can orchestrate activities, that can, automation was mentioned as well. If you see something happening, on the network that looks bad, well, can we automate the creation of a ticket to go out and pull that device off the network or take some kind of action quickly, as opposed to relying on somebody picking up the phone and calling somebody to go take another task. Let's automate as many of these activities as we can, so we can, really be as responsive as possible. So we need to make it easy, in my opinion, for the employees in a SOC or the employees at a service desk to take the actions that are needed to respond to these incidents and as they occur, and catch them as quickly as we can. Things like SolarWinds, that was in the environment for months. People were unaware, and I don't know enough about the incident to say with certitude. But if you're looking at all the data in retrospect, were there clues? Was there some evidence that these bad things were happening and we were missing them? I don't know that to be the case, but I think we all need to be looking at the data that we're creating, all these security tools, and understanding it better, and being quick to take action, and again, automating as many of those things as we can.
Yeah, I'll add to that and say, because I think we had an earlier question or comment about AI systems and other tools like that will hopefully help eliminate some of that toil of having to sift through that data, the automation of having to sift through that data. But we do have a lot more data to look through, which I think also means we have a better shot of finding those potential threats and attackers in our systems, and we ought to be able to use that to our advantage if we are doing things like threat sharing and vulnerability sharing, and relying on that sort of data that we're now collecting with all the telemetry and continuous monitoring we're now doing in our systems.
On that same note with go ahead. I've been talking too much. You go ahead.
I was just saying, just to add on to everything, I completely agree with what everyone's saying. And these are all great and wonderful things to do, but you can't move to these levels without the core basics. When we're talking about cyber fatigue, make sure you know where your critical data is located. Make sure you know what your critical data is. Talk about how are we monitoring that? How are we protecting that? And then we move to the next steps. Moving on to these other steps and putting in this other technology in place is all very important, what we need to do, but not having that core fundamental basics, without having that first and foremost, you can't build a strong foundation. Your tower's going to fall, and then we see that time and time again. So, focus. If there's anything you can take away from today, right, focus on those basics first.
And I'd just say, as agency leaders, you have to be able to make that case to the senior leadership of your organizations in order to get the funding to do some of these things, because what you're describing isn't free. It's an investment. It's not program specific per se. Nobody likes to pay for infrastructure. So we have to, again, be very clear that these things have a real impact on mission delivery. And, it connects to the programs and the reason we're all in government and serving citizens. So you have to make that case. Otherwise, it's hard to get them funded.
Yeah, so I can't think of a better place to wrap up everything today, besides talking about the basics and how important they are. I really appreciate everyone sharing their insights this afternoon. That is all the time we have today. But before you go, I hope you hear a few quick reminders. We'll email you a link to the training, so check your inboxes tomorrow. It'll be coming your way. Also, don't forget to download additional resources from the console. They're definitely worth checking out. And on behalf of GovLoop, Red Hat, ServiceNow, and CyberArk, I hope you enjoyed our training today. Defeat cyber fatigue, how to keep hybrid work safe. We appreciate all the work that each of you do, and thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.